The stagecoach wheels creaked to a stop beneath the sharp noon sun, dust rising in thick clouds as Eleanor Parker stepped down with a twin balanced on each hip, her face flushed from the long journey west but lit with hope for the life waiting beyond the station. In her faded blue dress and hand-mended bonnet, she searched the dusty street for the man whose letters had promised her steady ground and kind shelter, a groom who spoke of cattle herds and warm fires, of a home built on patience, not pity. But Dust Creek met her with silence. Sheriff Alder approached first, hat in hand, his face lined with the heavy burden of bad news. Townsfolk gathered in quiet clusters, curious, pitying, some avoiding her gaze altogether, as the sheriff cleared his throat and spoke the words no letter had prepared her for. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Frank Harper passed this morning. Fell from his horse driving cattle across the South Ridge. Broke his neck clean. There was no saving him." Eleanor stood still, the twins squirming against her shoulders, their sleepy cries breaking the silence Frank Harper's absence left behind. She had crossed a continent for a man who no longer breathed, a wedding that would never be spoken, a home she had never seen. She asked, her voice steady though her knees threatened to fail, what would become of his homestead, his cattle, the roof he had promised them all. Sheriff Alder hesitated, then spoke quiet but clear. The Harper Ranch stood empty now, left to debts unpaid and fences falling down. No kin had come forward to claim it. The townsfolk whispered she should return east, that Dust Creek was no place for a widowed stranger with hungry mouths and no deed to her name. But Eleanor squared her shoulders against the stairs, adjusted the twins' weight in her arms, and asked for directions to Frank Harper's ranch. The sheriff blinked, caught between respect and disbelief, before pointing west toward the distant ridge where smoke no longer rose from the chimney. She nodded, thanked him with a grace he knew he didn't deserve, and walked away from the crowd without waiting for help or permission. With each step, the dust rose higher, the prairie stretched wider, and the weight of a broken promise settled deeper into her bones. But Eleanor Parker had buried hope before. She knew how to build again from ruins. And somewhere beyond the ridge, whether with cattle or without, she would build something her children could call home. The Harper Ranch came into view as the sun dipped low over the ridge, casting long shadows across a homestead that looked as tired as the woman approaching it. The porch sagged beneath years of wind and sun, the windows smudged with dust, and the front gate hung crooked on a single hinge. No smoke rose from the chimney, no lantern burned in the windows, and no one came to greet the woman who was supposed to be a bride by sundown. Eleanor set the twins down gently on the porch, their small bodies wrapped against the cooling air, and tried the door. It groaned open on rusty hinges, revealing a single-room cabin, sparsely furnished but not barren. A table with one chair, a cot pushed into the corner, a fireplace choked with cold ash, and shelves lined with canned peaches and beans, the simple remnants of a man who hadn't lived long enough to share them. She moved through the space quietly, setting down her small travel trunk beside the hearth, unwrapping the twins from their travel-worn blankets, and lighting the single oil lamp left by the stove. The flickering light softened the room's edges, but did little to chase away the loneliness pressing against the walls. That night, she fed the twins warm milk from the last of the clean tin cups, and tucked them close beside her in Frank Harper's empty cot, her arms wrapped around them as they slept. Beneath the thin roof, Eleanor stared at the cracked ceiling, listening to the prairie wind slip through the boards like whispers of what might have been. In the morning, she rose before the sun, filling the kettle with well water and sweeping the dirt floor clean. She found a rusted axe behind the barn and split enough wood to warm the stove. though every swing of the blade echoed through the hollow yard. She tended the chickens, still scratching in the yard, and gathered the few eggs left behind by Frank's absence. Alone in the pasture, she counted 6 cattle, skinny but alive, grazing on the brittle grass, and wondered if she could keep them fed through winter. No one came from Dust Creek. No neighbor knocked to check on the bride left without a groom. But Eleanor didn't wait for kindness. She built it, one breath at a time, from the ashes of what she'd lost. By sundown, the twins laughed for the first time since they stepped off the stage, and in that sound, beneath the empty sky, Eleanor Parker felt the first crack of light slip into her darkness. Dust Creek woke the next morning to the knowledge that Eleanor Parker hadn't left. No eastbound stage carried her away. No neighbor guided her back to safer places. Instead, word spread that the Harper Ranch had smoke rising from its chimney again, and the widow who never became a bride had milked his cows, chopped his wood, and hung laundry to dry on the crooked fence line. At the general store, voices clashed in low tones. Some said she was a fool, clinging to land she had no claim to, raising 2 mouths she couldn't feed. Others, quieter but sharper, said maybe the Lord sent her to finish what Frank started, and that leaving a mother and twins to starve was a shame no good town could carry long. Paul Granger, the storekeep, counted the day's flour stock and sighed, knowing he'd soon see her standing across his counter. Sure enough, before noon, Eleanor rode into town on Frank's old mule, dust on her hem and determination straight in her spine. She entered the store with the twins bundled against her chest and laid Frank's last letter on the counter, a contract promising her half the herd and the house in exchange for marriage. The paper was signed, though the marriage was never sealed. Paul read it slow, then met her steady gaze and asked what she planned to do now. She answered without blinking. She'd work the land as if his name had become hers, raise the twins on his fields, and pay for every bag of flour and nail strip with calves come spring. Paul rubbed his chin, and after a long pause, slid her 2 sacks of meal and a spool of thread, saying they'd settle the bill when the calves walked. Some folks outside whispered she'd never make it through winter. Others nodded slow, remembering that prairie women didn't survive because men saved them. They survived because the earth didn't offer softness, only space to try. When she rode home, the twins slept beneath the warming sun, and for the first time, the fields ahead looked less like a grave and more like a beginning. That night, as stars stitched themselves across the dark sky, Eleanor stitched new hems into the twins' clothes by lamplight, her needle steady, her heart still cracked but no longer hollow. Alone in a house built for 2, she worked by the rhythm of a dream left unfinished, not waiting for help, but ready to build anyway. The first snow fell faster than the calendar promised, sweeping across the prairie in thick, relentless sheets that buried fence lines and silenced the cattle's low calls before Eleanor Parker could gather enough wood to last a week. She worked through the storm, hauling water from the frozen well with numb fingers, her boots slipping on the iced earth as the twins cried softly from the cabin's single room where the fire crackled low. Each day she rose before dawn, splitting wood until her shoulders ached, milking the scrawny cows for thin streams of sustenance, and patching the drafty windows with worn flour sacks. No neighbor came calling, and Dust Creek stayed quiet beneath the storm's grip, but Eleanor didn't expect a rescue. She sang to the twins while wrapping them in quilts stitched from her wedding dress, the one she never wore, and spoke to them of summers that had not yet come, painting the future in words no cold could steal. On the 4th night, when the wind howled so loud it rattled the stovepipe, a soft knock broke through the storm's voice. Startled, Eleanor opened the door to find Sheriff Alder, hat low against the snow, holding a crate of potatoes and a sack of oats, his mustache crusted with frost. He said little, only that Paul Granger figured she might be running low, and that the men in town finally remembered the Harper place still had lights burning. She took the crate without flinching, thanked him with a nod that said she didn't owe Dust Creek anything but gratitude for the moment. Before he left, the sheriff tipped his hat and muttered that Frank Harper would have been proud. She shut the door against the storm, heart tight in her chest, and fed the twins warm oat mash until their cries softened into sleepy hums. The snow didn't stop for 3 more days, but inside, the house stayed warm enough to hold hope. When the skies finally cleared, Eleanor stepped outside into a world washed clean, the fields glittering beneath the sun like a new beginning laid bare. She strapped the twins to her chest, saddled the mule, and rode the fence line alone, counting the cattle still standing, still hers. And beneath the pale blue sky, where her wedding bells had never rung, and her husband's voice never spoke her name aloud, she whispered a promise that she'd keep his land breathing and their future alive, no matter who did or didn't stand beside her. When the snow melted and spring softened the earth, Eleanor Parker found herself staring at a fence half fallen, and a herd thinner than winter should have left. With a rusted hammer and splintered rails, she set to work alone, driving posts deep into the thawing ground as the twins played beneath the cottonwoods, their laughter soft against the morning wind. Her hands blistered, her shoulders burned, but no one else was coming to mend what Frank Harper left behind. Dust Creek watched from afar. Some men rode past the ridge and slowed their horses, tipping their hats in respect or pity. It was hard to tell. Paul Granger sent up nails with the next flour order, wrapped quiet in brown paper, and Sheriff Alder stopped by once a week, never staying long but always leaving behind something useful. A bag of seed, a coil of rope, a kind word he never lingered long enough to finish. Eleanor didn't ask for more. The land had taught her that survival owed no one its comfort. By late spring, the pasture fence stood straight again, stitched together by her grit and the stubborn refusal to let the prairie take what she'd claimed. The cattle, lean but alive, grazed along the hills, and the first calf was born beneath a pale dawn, its cry splitting the morning quiet like a prayer answered without fanfare. She named him Lucky. The twins grew with the grass, their small steps steadying into toddling runs, their laughter filling the spaces between chores. Eleanor taught them how to gather eggs from the henhouse, how to water the garden rows where beans and squash stretched eager toward the sun. At night, beneath the soft crackle of the stove, she read Frank's old Bible aloud, not for salvation, but for rhythm, letting the words fill the house with something bigger than her loneliness. In town, whispers softened. What was once mockery became quiet admiration, though pride kept most from speaking it aloud. By midsummer, Dust Creek knew the Harper Ranch no longer sat empty. It was a widow's place now, though no ring marked her finger and no man's name spoke for her deeds. She had built a life where only grief had been promised. And as the prairie wind settled warm against her skin one quiet evening, Eleanor rested her hammer beside the fence and smiled, small but true. Some lives were built with help, others, plank by plank, in the quiet between heartbreaks. Late summer brought more than calves and harvest. It brought strangers through Dust Creek, men who smelled of sweat and whiskey, their voices too loud for the quiet town. 3 drifters rode in from the south, claiming they'd worked Frank Harper's cattle once, though no one could recall their faces when Frank lived. They found Eleanor Parker at the market, loading flour onto Frank's old mule, her twins nestled in the shade of the mercantile's porch. One called her by her new title, Widow, and the word curled like a snake in the dusty street. He asked who gave her claim to Harper's land and cattle, what right a woman had to guard what death left behind. Eleanor met his sneer with the same steady calm she had met winter, pointing out that Frank's name may have faded, but the deed to the land, signed and sealed with his hand, rested in her trunk. The sheriff, watching from across the street, stepped forward then, voice calm but firm, reminding the drifters that Dust Creek had little tolerance for men who mistook grief for weakness. But trouble rides stubborn where pride stirs it, and the men left town that day only to return after dark, slipping onto the Harper Ranch when the oil lamps burned low and Eleanor rocked the twins to sleep beside the fire. She heard them before she saw them. The soft creak of the fence gate, the crunch of boots across the yard. Rifle in hand, she stepped onto the porch, heart steady but fast, the barrel leveled as steady as her voice when she called out. She warned them once, her words sharp as a winter night, telling them no claim would be won by thieves in the dark. The drifters hesitated, caught between their greed and the barrel of a woman who had faced worse than them. When Sheriff Alder and 2 townsmen rode in behind them, rifles ready, the night broke quiet again. Without a word, the strangers turned and rode south, their shadows swallowed by the prairie's dark. The sheriff tipped his hat, offering her no lecture, only a quiet nod of respect before riding away. Inside, the twins slept on, unaware that their mother had stood between them and the world's cruelty once again. Eleanor closed the door, bolted it firm, and sat alone beneath the flickering lamp. Her hands trembled now that the danger passed, but her spirit did not. Some nights were won by courage loud as gunfire, others by standing your ground when fear told you to run. And in that lonely room, Eleanor knew she was strong enough for both. Autumn crept across the ridge, painting the fields gold and rust, softening the sharp edges of the summer that had nearly broken them. Eleanor Parker walked the pasture fence with a new quiet in her heart, watching calves fatten beneath the pale sun, and the wheat she planted rise taller than the twins beside her. It wasn't prosperity, not yet, but it was enough to fill the root cellar and see them through the winter without fear of hunger at the door. Dust Creek changed with the season, too. Where once whispers followed her steps, now greetings met her at the post office and the general store. Paul Granger offered her the first cut of sugar when the shipment came light. Even the old blacksmith, who once scowled as she passed, offered to shoe her mule without asking who'd pay. Sheriff Alder stopped by from time to time, never staying for supper, but always checking the fence lines with her, his quiet presence a steady reassurance she'd once thought she didn't need. But for all the help offered now, Eleanor still carried the truth alone. If the land had failed, if her strength had buckled, Dust Creek would have buried her story beside Frank Harper's without a second thought. But the land hadn't failed. And neither had she. One crisp morning, as frost kissed the pumpkins by the porch and the twins chased leaves down the dusty lane, Eleanor found herself standing before the rough stone marker she'd set for Frank. The simple words she carved by hand months before still caught her throat. Gone too soon, but not forgotten. She spoke aloud then, quiet but steady, thanking him for the chance he gave her, even if fate stole the man before the promise. "Your land is safe," she whispered, voice catching in the wind. "Your home stands." That night, after the twins fell asleep by the fire, Eleanor sat on the porch beneath a sky so wide it stole the breath from her chest. She rocked slowly in Frank's old chair, watching the stars blink alive one by one, and for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she let herself imagine staying. Not out of duty, not out of stubbornness, but because somewhere between grief and grit, this patch of earth became hers. And in that quiet, where the prairie stretched endless and kind, Eleanor Parker smiled softly to herself, knowing that what she built out of heartbreak, no man or storm could tear down again. The first hard frost brought Dust Creek's townsfolk up the ridge, not with rifles or rumors, but with offers of trade and quiet help. Eleanor heard the wagon wheels before she saw them. Paul Granger, Sheriff Alder, and two young ranch hands from the south side, each carrying seed bags, spare tools, and jars of preserves the preacher's wife insisted she couldn't eat alone. They gathered awkwardly in her yard, where the fence stood tall, the cattle grazed steady, and the widow who never married kept her rifle resting but unloaded beside the porch rail. Sheriff Alder cleared his throat first, tipping his hat. "Winter's meaner when folks face it alone. Figured you could use a few extra hands fixing the north fence before the snow traps us in." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, searching for pity and finding none. Only the quiet kind of respect men give to those who've carried what they couldn't. She nodded once, slow and steady, and led them to the pasture where the posts still leaned tired against the wind. All morning they worked, side by side without speeches or thanks. When the last rail stood firm, Granger wiped his brow and asked if she planned to stay through next spring. Eleanor answered only with a faint smile and a glance toward the twins, tumbling in the tall grass, their laughter warmer than the sun. At dusk, the men shared a pot of stew by her fire, filling her porch with stories of lost cattle, stubborn mules, and how Frank Harper used to hum badly when he mended fence lines alone. For the first time, the cabin's walls felt less like protection and more like belonging. When they left, they promised to return before the first blizzard, though none said it like charity. As the wagon wheels faded down the ridge, Eleanor sat alone beneath the wide sky, the twins sleeping soundly inside. For months, the prairie had been her only witness. Now, Dust Creek had finally seen her too. Not as a stranger, not as a tragedy, but as one of their own. She rested her boots on the rail and let the night stretch soft and slow around her, the wind carrying no threats, only the quiet peace of a life rebuilt. Somewhere beyond the hills, storms would come. But tonight, beneath a sky stitched with stars, Eleanor Parker was no longer the bride without a wedding. She was the woman who stayed, the mother who endured, and the soul who carved her place where no one thought she could. Winter passed slow and harsh across the ridge, but Eleanor Parker faced it steady, her fire burning long through the cold nights, and her roof holding firm against the storms. The twins grew another inch beneath the weight of snow, their laughter now a daily rhythm beneath the rafters, their small boots thudding across the cabin floor like proof that life carried on. By spring, the frost cracked and lifted from the ground, leaving the pasture ready for new fence lines and fresh seed. Eleanor hitched Frank's old mule and tilled the earth herself, sweat soaking her brow beneath a sky finally warm enough to forgive. Dust Creek sent help without asking now. Young Thomas Grady offered fence nails in trade for a week's worth of eggs. Paul Granger dropped off sacks of seed without waiting for payment. Sheriff Alder repaired her wagon wheel on a Sunday afternoon and stayed long enough to share a cup of coffee, but not long enough to make it more than kindness. Eleanor let them help, though her pride still carried a sharp edge. She planted squash, beans, and corn, taught the twins how to water the rows without drowning the roots, and showed them where wildflowers grew along the fence line for no reason but beauty. One afternoon, as rain clouds gathered slow beyond the hills, she found herself laughing, deep and full, when the twins chased each other through the muddy yard, their shrieks cutting across the sky like birds too free to trap. She couldn't remember the last time her chest felt that light. Later, she sat beneath the cottonwood Frank had planted years before, watching the wind stir its leaves. She spoke softly then, telling the quiet earth that his ranch still stood, his cattle still roamed, and his home, now hers, was filled with voices too loud for loneliness to silence. Dust Creek stopped calling her the mail-order bride after that spring. They spoke of her as Eleanor Harper, though no preacher ever spoke the name aloud. Not because she wore his ring, but because she wore his work, his land, his quiet grit. And in the stillness of the coming summer, as the crops stretched taller and the twins fell asleep beside the hearth, Eleanor finally felt it settle. She hadn't been waiting for life to begin again. She'd been living it all along, one hard-earned breath at a time. And beneath the rising moon, where cattle lowed soft across the fields, her story felt like home at last. By the time summer painted the prairie gold, Eleanor Parker stood where no one ever thought she would. Rooted, steady, and free. The Harper Ranch, once a place she'd arrived at as a stranger with 2 sleeping children and a suitcase of fragile hope, now bore her hands in every post, every planted row, and every shingle on the roof. The twins, sun-browned and wild-hearted, ran the ridge like they owned it, their laughter chasing the wind beyond the fence line, their boots covered in dust and joy. Dust Creek no longer whispered about the bride left without a groom. They spoke of the woman who kept the Harper name alive, without needing a husband to hold it steady. Paul Granger trusted her credit like any other rancher's. Sheriff Alder tipped his hat each Sunday as she rode into town, his smile warm but respectful, knowing better than to offer what she hadn't asked for. And when neighbors spoke of the coming harvest, they asked for her counsel, not her pity. Eleanor built a legacy without realizing it, one quiet act of survival at a time. She raised calves that lived through winter, planted corn that rose strong against the dry winds, and mended fences the prairie tried to steal each spring. But beyond the chores and cattle, she built something rarer, a home where the past didn't own her, and the future was hers to shape. One quiet evening, as the sun slid soft behind the western hills, she sat on the porch with the twins nestled against her sides, their heads resting on her shoulders. They asked her why they didn't leave when Pa died, why they stayed when the world told them to go. She smiled then, slow and steady, and told them this. Sometimes the place where your heart breaks is the place where it learns to beat again. They didn't understand fully, but one day they would. As the stars blinked awake across the wide sky, Eleanor Parker laid her grief to rest beside Frank Harper's marker. Not in sorrow, but in gratitude. He'd written her a letter that promised a home. Life had written her something harder, but in the end, something better. And beneath the endless sky where storms once threatened to break her, she remained, unmarried but not alone, scarred but not broken, a mother, a rancher, and a woman who turned loss into belonging. Some stories never find their wedding bells. But in the quiet places of the West, sometimes survival is the truest love story of all.